Number 1. Chicago, 1890. A black man walks into a building on South State Street and opens a saloon. Not remarkable. Not yet. What's remarkable is what's about to happen inside that building over the next 17 years. Because this was not just a saloon. This was a gambling house, a policy operation, a numbers empire that would make this man the richest black person in the city of Chicago and one of the most politically connected figures in Illinois. His name was John V. Johnson. The streets called him Mushmouth. And before Bumpy Johnson ever ran Harlem, before Teddy Roe ever defied the Chicago outfit, before the Jones brothers ever turned a nickel game into a $25 million a year empire, there was Mushmouth Johnson, the original, the man who proved it could be done. He wasn't born into power, he wasn't connected, he didn't have a mentor or a family name or a crew behind him. He was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1856. His mother had once been a nurse who cared for Mary Todd Lincoln, the president's wife. That's the highest connection his family had. When he came to Chicago in the 1870s, he came as a waiter at the Palmer House Hotel, serving food to wealthy white men who would never have imagined that the man refilling their water glasses was studying every card game, every dice table, every policy wheel he could find. He watched, he learned, he saved. And then he opened his own nickel gambling house on Clark Street. A nickel game. That's where it started. 1 decade later, the Chicago Tribune called his establishment on South State Street the most popular gambling house in the entire city of Chicago. Not the most popular black gambling house, the most popular gambling house. Period. He called it the Emporium, and it was exactly what the name promised. Black or white, rich or poor, working man or politician, everyone who walked through the door of the Emporium got the same treatment. That was revolutionary in Chicago in the 1890s. A city rigidly segregated in almost every other way, where black men were turned away from restaurants and hotels and theaters, had one place where the color of your skin bought you the same seat at the same table. Mushmouth Johnson built that place. He also did something that would define every black policy king who came after him. He paid politicians, not as a victim paying for protection, as a businessman making investments. He bought aldermen, he funded campaigns, he delivered votes to the politicians who needed them, and those politicians made sure the police looked the other way when they walked past the Emporium. He became so politically powerful that the Chicago Tribune wrote about him regularly, not as a criminal, as a power broker. He asked the Tribune once, "What else is there for a colored man to do?" That question landed in 1897. It lands just as hard today. The Italian mob was rising in Chicago at the same time Mushmouth was building his empire. They were moving through the city's south side, organizing, consolidating, taxing every operation they could reach. They never reached Mushmouth Johnson, not because they did not try, because he had something they could not buy and could not threaten away. He had the politicians, the same men the Italian mob needed to operate freely in Chicago. Mushmouth had already paid for them, had already delivered their elections, had already made himself so valuable to the city's political machine that coming after his operation meant coming after the machine itself. The Italian mob understood one thing above everything else. Do not fight a battle you cannot win. They could not win that one. So Mushmouth Johnson ran his empire until 1907, when pneumonia took him at 50 years old. 17 years of continuous operation. The Emporium never closed, never got shut down, never got taken. He died the richest black man in Chicago, and he left behind something more valuable than money. He left behind a blueprint. Every black policy king who came after him, Teddy Roe, the Jones brothers, every man who ran a wheel on the South Side for the next 60 years was building on the foundation Mushmouth Johnson laid. He showed them it was possible, that a black man from St. Louis with no education and no connections could walk into Chicago and build an empire that the most powerful criminal organization in America could not touch. Not by being the most violent, not by having the biggest crew, by being smarter, more connected, more essential to the city's power structure than the men who wanted to take what he built. That's the blueprint. John Mushmouth Johnson, the black gambling king of Chicago, the original, and the man who started everything that came after. Al Capone was afraid of one man, not the FBI. He owned half the agents in Chicago, not the police. They were on his payroll, not rival Italian gangs. He wiped them out on Valentine's Day, and he didn't lose a night's sleep. Al Capone was the man who ordered the massacre of 7 men in a garage. He beat 2 associates to death with a baseball bat at a dinner party while the other guests watched. He controlled every square inch of Chicago and had judges, senators, and police chiefs eating out of his hand. Yet he looked at the South Side and decided he was not going over there. Because on the South Side of Chicago, there was a black man who had made it very clear what would happen to anyone, Italian, Irish, or otherwise, who tried to take what was his. That man carried a loaded revolver every single day of his adult life. He had a temper that went from 0 to gunfire in a heartbeat. He shot men in the street and walked away while they bled out on the pavement. He beat collectors unconscious with his bare hands for shortchanging his customers. He had a crew of off-duty police officers who worked as his personal bodyguards, not because he was scared, but because the bodies were starting to attract attention. And when word reached him that Capone's men were asking questions about the South Side, about the money, the operation, the territory, Roe sent back a message that every Italian in Chicago understood. Come and take it. See what happens. They didn't come. Not while Capone was alive, not for nearly 20 years. Because Al Capone, the most violent gangster in American history, did the math. He looked at what this man had done to people who crossed him. He looked at the loyalty this man commanded from an entire community. He looked at the bodies, and Capone made the only smart decision of his career. He left Teddy Roe alone. Theodore Teddy Roe, born to a sharecropper. He never spent a day in school. He taught himself to read, to fight, to sew a suit, and to shoot a man between the eyes. He built a $1 million empire from nickels and dimes. He killed a made man of the Italian Mafia with his bare hands and beat the murder charge. He was offered $250,000 to walk away, and he said, "If I'm going down, I'm going down like a man. I don't run." And 20 years after they finally killed him, 20 years later, the mob boss who ordered the hit was caught on an FBI wiretap saying, "I'll say this, black or no black, that bastard went out like a man. He had balls." That was the only time in the history of the Italian Mafia that a boss admitted on tape, in his own words, that a black man was tougher than his entire organization. This is the story of Teddy Roe. And it's the most dangerous story in Chicago history that nobody ever told you. So who was Teddy Roe? To understand what Teddy Roe did, you have to understand who he was. Because this was not a man who stumbled into greatness. This was a man who was built for war from the day he was born. He came into the world on August 26, 1898, in Galliano, Louisiana, deep in the bayou, about as far from power as a human being could get. His father was a sharecropper. That meant he worked someone else's land, paid rent with a portion of the harvest, and stayed poor no matter what he did. It was legal slavery with a receipt. Roe was raised in Little Rock, Arkansas. He never received a single day of formal education. Not one. Everything he ever learned, he taught himself or learned on the street. He was self-taught. As a boy, he worked for a tailor, running errands and learning to sew. That skill would follow him his entire life. Years later, when he was the most powerful black racketeer in Chicago, when he had a wardrobe that made movie stars jealous, people would ask where he got his suits made. He made them himself. The man could sew a suit by hand and shoot a Mafia enforcer in the face on the same day. And he had another quality that set him apart from almost every other black man in his era. Teddy Roe could pass for white. His complexion was light enough that, in certain rooms, certain settings, people assumed he was Italian or Mediterranean or anything other than what he was. In Jim Crow America, that ability was a weapon. It gave him access to places, information, and conversations that no one expected a black man to hear. By his early 20s, Roe was bootlegging. He was making money, building a reputation as a man who was reliable, tough, and not to be trifled with. When he married Carrie in 1923, he tried to go straight. He moved to Detroit and worked in an automobile plant. But the job did not last. He was laid off. With no money, no prospects, and no education, Roe did what millions of black Americans had done before him, and he headed for Chicago. He arrived on the South Side in the late 1920s, and he walked into a world that would make him a king. Why Al Capone stayed away. In the 1930s, on the South Side of Chicago, in the neighborhood called Bronzeville, there was an underground economy that was bigger than most legitimate businesses in the city. It was called the policy game, a street lottery. You paid a nickel and you picked your numbers. If your numbers hit, you got paid. It was illegal, it was wildly popular, and it generated millions of dollars every single year. The men who ran the policy wheels were called the policy kings. In an era when segregation locked black Americans out of banks, out of business loans, and out of the legitimate economy entirely, the policy kings were the community. They were the employers. They were the banks. They were the ones who funded churches, opened department stores, paid for funerals, and kept the South Side alive. The famous writer Richard Wright once said of them, they would have been steel tycoons, Wall Street brokers, and auto moguls had they been white. Roe started at the bottom. He was hired as a runner, a salesman who walked the streets collecting bets. But his boss, the biggest policy king in Chicago, saw something in him immediately. Not just intelligence, not just loyalty, controlled, purposeful, terrifying violence. Roe became the enforcer first, the fixer, the man they sent when a rival wheel was stealing customers, the man they sent when a collector was skimming, the man they sent when somebody needed to understand, physically, painfully, permanently, that the South Side had rules, and those rules were not suggestions. He climbed from runner to enforcer, to lieutenant to partner. And by the time he reached the top, every hustler, every bookie, every street operator on the South Side knew two things about Teddy Roe. He would give you the shirt off his back if you were in need, and he would put you in the ground if you crossed him. There were stories, the kind of stories that do not make the newspapers, but travel through neighborhoods like electricity through a wire. Stories about what happened to men who tried to cheat Roe's operation. Stories about men who had walked into meetings with Roe confident and walked out missing teeth, or did not walk out at all. Stories about a man who always had a revolver on his body, who had a fuse shorter than a match, and who had proven more than once that he was willing to use both. By the mid-1940s, the policy game on the South Side was generating over $25 million a year, and Teddy Roe had become a policy king himself, running his own wheels, commanding his own territory, building his own empire inside the empire. Now here is the part that most people don't know, the part that tells you everything about how dangerous Teddy Roe really was. Al Capone knew about the policy game. Of course he did. Capone controlled Chicago. He controlled the police, the politicians, the judges, the unions, the bootlegging, the gambling, everything. His organization, the Chicago Outfit, was the most powerful criminal enterprise in America. Capone had taken over the North Side by machine gunning 7 men in a garage. He had taken over Cicero by sending 200 armed men into the streets on Election Day. He had taken over the labor unions by bombing businesses that refused to comply. Al Capone did not ask permission. Al Capone took what he wanted, from everyone, except the South Side. Capone sent scouts into the Black Belt. They came back with reports, and the reports all said the same thing. The men who ran the policy game were not soft. They were not businessmen pretending to be tough. They were armed, organized, deeply embedded in a community that would die for them, and led by a man, Teddy Roe, who had a reputation for settling disputes with a pistol, not a handshake. Capone's men had seen what happened to people who tried to muscle in on Roe's territory. They had heard what Roe did to collectors who betrayed him. They knew that Roe's crew included off-duty Chicago police officers who were loyal to him, not to the department. And they knew that starting a war on the South Side meant fighting in neighborhoods where every face was hostile, every alley was a trap, and the man at the top would rather die shooting than surrender a single dollar. So Capone did something he almost never did. He backed off. His men would stay out of the South Side. The policy racket belonged to the black community. In exchange, the policy kings would stay out of the beer and liquor business. Capone controlled booze. The kings controlled numbers. Each side stayed in its lane. But make no mistake about what that deal really was. That wasn't a partnership between equals. That wasn't diplomacy. That was Al Capone, the most feared man in America, looking at Teddy Roe and deciding that the cost of war was too high, that the man on the other side of that line was too dangerous, that the South Side of Chicago was the one place in the city where the Italian Mafia could not simply walk in and take over. That deal held for nearly 20 years, through Capone's reign, through his imprisonment, through the transition of power to the men who came after him. For 2 decades, the South Side of Chicago was the one piece of territory that the Italian Mafia did not control. And then Capone was gone, and the new generation, younger, hungrier, and stupid enough to think they were tougher than the men who came before them, decided to break the old deal. They had no idea what they were walking into. The man in the mirror fireplace. Before we get to the war, you need to understand how Teddy Roe carried himself. This was not just a gangster. This was a man who turned himself into an institution. By the mid-1940s, Roe was one of the most recognizable figures on the South Side. He wore custom-made suits he had personally tailored because the sharecropper's son, who learned to sew as a child, never lost the skill. He wore monogrammed silk shirts, alligator shoes, painted ties, wide-brimmed hats tilted at an angle that said, "I know exactly who I am." He spent $50,000 decorating his apartment on South Michigan Avenue. The living room had a fireplace made entirely of mirrors, floor to ceiling, every surface reflecting light. He had a 6-foot television set, enormous for the era, mounted on a turntable so he could rotate it to any angle in the room by pressing a single button. In the 1940s, most people did not even have television. Teddy Roe had a rotating one, but the style was only the surface. Underneath, Roe operated with a code that made him beloved in the community and feared on the streets. He earned the nickname Robin Hood, and it was no joke. He paid hospital bills for newborn babies whose families could not afford the cost. He paid funeral expenses for the dead when their relatives had nothing. He loaned money to his own employees and then forgave the debts. When an elderly woman played the numbers on a rival wheel and the operators refused to pay her winnings, Roe went over there personally with some of his men and persuaded them to pay what they owed. Nobody cheated a customer on Teddy Roe's South Side. He was the unofficial referee of the policy game, the supreme court of the streets. If there was a dispute, Roe settled it. If there was injustice, Roe corrected it. He ran his operation with a fairness that legitimate businesses could not match, because in the policy game, your reputation was your currency, and Roe's reputation was flawless. But do not let any of that fool you into thinking he was soft. Teddy Roe had a hair-trigger temper. He was good with his fists. He was better with a gun. He was always armed, always, and everyone who knew him understood that he was not a man who bluffed. When he said something, he meant it. When he made a threat, it was a promise. And when someone came at him, he came back harder. That combination, the silk shirts and the loaded revolver, the hospital bills and the hair-trigger temper, the mirror fireplace, and the willingness to kill, is what made Teddy Roe untouchable for as long as he lived. In 1946, the Italian Mafia made its move. The new leadership of the Chicago outfit had looked at the numbers. $25 million a year flowed through the South Side. Pennies and nickels from the poorest people in Chicago added up to a fortune. All of it was controlled by black men with no protection from the outfit, no political allies powerful enough to stop a takeover, and no military force that could match the full weight of the Italian Mafia. The boss sent his most ambitious soldier, the young killer who had learned about the policy game while sharing a prison cell with a policy king who had foolishly trusted him. He had pumped his cellmate for every detail, the money, the structure, the operations, the weaknesses, and now he had the backing of the entire organization. The first move was a kidnapping. They snatched the biggest policy king in Chicago, grabbed him off the street, and held him for 5 days with tape over his eyes and cotton in his ears. The ransom was $100,000 in cash and a promise to hand over the entire policy operation. Teddy Roe paid the ransom. His boss was released, but the message was clear. The outfit was taking over. Pay the street tax, hand over control, or die. This is where the story splits. This is where one man's decision changed everything. The policy king who had been kidnapped took his money and fled to Mexico. His brother went with him. They were never heard from in Chicago again. Then, one by one, every other major policy operator on the South Side made the same choice. Some paid the tax, some handed over their wheels, some simply vanished, packed a bag in the middle of the night, and drove until they hit a state line. The outfit was too powerful. The violence was too extreme. The message was too clear. Within months, practically every black numbers operator in Chicago had either surrendered or disappeared. Every single one, except Teddy Roe. When the outfit came to him with the same demand, pay the tax, hand over control, or face the consequences, Roe did not negotiate. He did not ask for terms. He did not stall for time. He said no, flat, final, absolute. And then he did not run. He did not hide. He did not leave Chicago. He took over everything. Every wheel that the fleeing policy kings had abandoned, Roe absorbed. Every territory they had left behind, Roe claimed. Every customer who had lost their operator, Roe served. He did not shrink. He expanded. At the exact moment when the Italian Mafia was trying to crush the black policy game, Teddy Roe became bigger than he had ever been. His operation was pulling in over $1 million a year, all of it in pennies, nickels, and dimes. All of it from the same South Side neighborhoods that the outfit was trying to control. Roe ran every cent of it with his name on it, daring them to come take it. They came. The outfit sent enforcers into the black wards. They bombed Roe's house. They fired shots at his wife and children. They beat up his collectors on the street. They took over gambling parlors. They set up their own bookie joints in taverns, barber shops, even church parking lots, anywhere they could plant a flag in territory that had belonged to black operators for decades. In 6 months, 12 Italian mob soldiers and an unknown number of Roe's men turned up dead on Chicago's streets and in its back alleys. This was a full-scale gang war, the most powerful criminal organization in America against one black man and his crew. And Roe was holding the line. Now the Italians understood why Al Capone had stayed away. Now they understood what the old boss had seen and calculated when he looked at the South Side and decided it was not worth the blood. Capone had been smart enough to respect the danger. These younger men had been arrogant enough to ignore it. They were paying for that arrogance in body bags. Every time they hit him, he hit back. Every time they took a parlor, he took one back. Every time they sent a message, he sent a louder one. His survival alone was an act of defiance. The fact that he was still alive, still operating, still collecting bets and paying winners, that was a humiliation for the outfit. They had the entire Chicago underworld under their control. They had hundreds of soldiers, they had police captains, aldermen, judges, and they couldn't break one man. The black community rallied behind Roe like he was a general in a war, because that's exactly what he was. People started placing their bets with Roe, specifically because he was fighting. Gambling with Teddy Roe became an act of resistance. His business didn't shrink during the war, it grew. The more the outfit attacked him, the more customers he attracted. The South Side was voting with its nickels. Finally, the outfit's top boss tried a different approach. He sat down with Roe personally. No soldiers, no threats, just 2 men in a room. The boss offered Roe $250,000 in cash, an astronomical sum, enough to retire, enough to disappear, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life. The deal was simple. Take the money and walk away. Quit the policy rackets. Let the outfit have the South Side. Roe didn't flinch. He didn't think about it. He didn't ask for a day to consider. He looked the most dangerous man in Chicago in the eye and said he would die first. If he was going down, he would go down like a man. He said he did not run, and he told the boss to remember that. The boss leaned back and said, "Well, buddy boy, you just might." After that meeting, Roe told reporters, pounding his chest with his fist, that they would have to kill him to take him. He was not performing. He was not posturing. This was the same man who had made Al Capone think twice. The same man who had left bodies in alleys and walked home to press his suit for the next morning. The same man who had been settling disputes with a revolver since before these young Italian soldiers were old enough to hold a gun. He was making a statement of fact, and the Italian Mafia, for the first time in their history, was dealing with a man who meant every word. In the summer of 1951, the outfit sent a crew to kidnap Teddy Roe. Not to kill him, to kidnap him, the way they had kidnapped his old boss years earlier. Grab him, hold him, squeeze him until he broke. The crew was led by a made man, a full member of the Italian Mafia, sworn in with blood and oaths. He was a soldier, an enforcer, a killer who had been doing the outfit's dirty work for years. He was also the brother of one of the outfit's most feared captains. This was not a low-level thug. This was someone who was supposed to be untouchable. They set up along a South Side street and flagged Roe's car down, pretending to be police officers. Roe pulled over. He demanded identification. Before he could process what was happening, they jumped him. But Teddy Roe was always armed, and Teddy Roe did not freeze. A fight broke out between Roe and the made man. Punches, grappling, and then a gunshot. Roe pulled his pistol and fired. The made man dropped with a bullet through his head, dead on the street. Another attacker took a round in the shoulder. The rest of the crew scrambled into their car and fled. Think about what just happened. In 1951, in Jim Crow America, in a city controlled by the Italian Mafia, in a neighborhood where the police worked for the outfit, a black man had just shot and killed a made member of the Chicago mob in a street gunfight, in broad daylight, and walked away alive. In the entire history of organized crime in America, made men were untouchable. Killing one was a declaration of war against the entire organization. It had almost never happened, and when it did, the person responsible usually ended up in a ditch within 48 hours. Teddy Roe ended up in a courtroom, charged with murder. His lawyers argued self-defense. They were able to prove connections between prosecutors and the mob, causing key evidence to be thrown out. He was denied bail 6 times before and during the trial. The jury acquitted him. When word spread through the South Side that Teddy Roe killed an Italian-made man and beat the case, he transcended gangster status. He became something larger, a symbol, proof that a black man could stand up to the most powerful criminal organization in America and not just survive, but win. A Chicago police detective who transported Roe to court later told his son that the people of the neighborhood loved Roe. He was like a Robin Hood to them. He was respected because he refused to give in to the Italians. You know how they say a crook with honor? That describes Roe. After the killing, the outfit launched a brutal campaign of revenge against every black bookmaker in Chicago. Dozens were shot at, beaten, or driven out of the city permanently. The message was clear. This is what happens when you associate with Teddy Roe. Roe retreated to his mansion on South Michigan Avenue. He hired bodyguards, off-duty police officers, armed men, a small army stationed around his home at all times. For months, he did not leave. He ran his operation from behind fortified walls, protected by guns and loyalty, waiting for whatever came next. On August 1st, 1952, what came next was not a bullet. Doctors told him he had inoperable stomach cancer. Terminal. He was dying, not from the outfit, not from a shotgun, from a disease that no amount of money or firepower could stop. And Teddy Roe made one final decision. He sent his bodyguards home, every single one. He dismissed the entire security detail. He did not need them anymore. He was going to die on his own terms, not behind walls, not surrounded by guards, not hiding. 3 days later, on the evening of August 4th, 1952, Theodore Teddy Roe put on a 3-piece suit, a pressed shirt, and a hat, the same way he had dressed every day of his adult life. The sharecropper's son, who had taught himself to sew, who had built a $1 million empire from nickels, who had killed a made man with his own hands and beaten the charge, he dressed himself one last time like the king he was. He told his wife Carrie he was going out. He walked out the front door of 5239 South Michigan Avenue. Mafia hitmen were already parked on the street. They had been watching, waiting. As Roe approached his car, someone called his name. Roe. He turned. 5 blasts from 2 12-gauge shotguns hit him in the back, the jaw, and the face. He never had a chance to pull his revolver. He died, slumped against a tree on the sidewalk outside his own home. He was 53 years old. His wife heard the gunshots. She screamed his name. No answer. She opened the door and found him in a pool of blood on the pavement. The next morning, the Chicago newspapers reported that the king is dead. Teddy Roe was laid out in a casket that cost $5,000. In 1952, that was more than most families earned in a year. His funeral was the largest for any black person in Chicago since Jack Johnson, the first African-American world heavyweight boxing champion, had died in 1946. Over 6,000 people came to the church on Wabash Avenue. Thousands more lined the streets outside. 81 cars followed the hearse in a funeral procession that stretched for blocks through the South Side. People wept openly. Strangers held each other. The entire community stopped to mourn a man who had done what no one else had dared to do. The minister stood before the mourners and said, "He was a friend of man, and he had a pure heart." No one was ever charged with his murder. Police questioned a dozen high-ranking members of the Italian Mafia, including the very men who had orchestrated the takeover of the policy game. But no charges were filed. No trial. No justice. The outfit had won. After Roe's death, the Italian Mafia seized complete control of the South Side policy racket. Within a few years, the numbers game became their most profitable operation, bringing in $150 million per year. The money that had once flowed through black-owned businesses, employed black workers, and funded black institutions was now in Italian hands. The economic backbone of the South Side was broken. The community that Teddy Roe had fought to protect was dismantled, not by the police, not by the government, but by the same men who had come for Roe and found one man standing in their way for 6 years while every other man in the city ran. And 20 years later, on a federal wiretap, the boss who had ordered Roe's murder said words that proved, even in death, even after 2 decades, Teddy Roe had earned the one thing the Italian Mafia almost never gave anyone: respect. I'll say this, black or no black, that bastard went out like a man. He had balls. That was Teddy Roe, the boy who never went to school, the bootlegger who taught himself to sew, the Robin Hood who paid for funerals and hospital bills, the policy king who killed a made man with his bare hands and beat the murder charge, the man who was offered $250,000 to walk away and said, "I'll die first," the man who learned he was dying of cancer, sent his guards home, put on a 3-piece suit, and walked out the front door one last time. They killed him, but they never broke him, and the South Side of Chicago never forgot his name. They called it the Harlem Gold Rush, pennies wagered on dreams, millions changing hands far from Wall Street. Madam Stephanie St. Clair ran the numbers, and Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson kept her empire safe. But when Dutch Schultz, New York's most ruthless mobster, tried to steal it all, Harlem exploded into a war that left over 40 dead. Behind the violence, backroom talks with Italy's Mafia would decide who would control Black Harlem's fortunes and who would not survive. But what secret deal forced the city's criminal order to redraw its boundaries forever? The answer starts at Harlem's street corners, where the stakes were more than money. Every morning in Harlem, numbers runners fanned out through crowded streets, collecting slips from hopeful bettors. The game was simple. Pick a 3-digit number, hand over a penny, a nickel, or maybe $1, and wait for the draw at the end of the day. Odds of winning ranged from 5 to 1 to 10 to 1, far better than the state lottery decades later. Most bets were tiny, but the sheer volume meant policy banks handled thousands each day. By nightfall, the winning number was set, usually pulled from the published totals of horse racing bets or bank clearings, making it seem fair and unrigged. Payouts could turn a few cents into a week's wages, and winners were paid in cash, no questions asked. The real money, though, belonged to the operators who controlled the slips, the clearinghouses, and the flow of bets. In Harlem, control over those slips meant power, economic, social, and soon, violent. Stephanie St. Clair ran Harlem's numbers business with the precision of a seasoned banker. Known as the Policy Queen, she managed a tight network of collectors and writers, keeping the operation honest and the odds fair. Her reputation for paying out winners and protecting her people made her a fixture in the neighborhood, both respected and untouchable. At her side stood Ellsworth "Bumpy" Johnson, whose name carried weight even before the war began. Johnson's presence alone discouraged rivals and kept the streets in check. He handled disputes, enforced St. Clair's rules, and made sure threats did not linger long. Together, St. Clair's business sense and Johnson's muscle formed the backbone of Harlem's numbers world. Their control meant steady work for hundreds and a lifeline for families who depended on the racket's underground economy. Any outsider hoping to break in would have to face them first. Gunfire echoed through Harlem's side streets as the numbers war exploded into open bloodshed. Dutch Schultz's men fanned out in daylight, ambushing runners and torching policy spots that refused to pay tribute. Harlem's numbers operators, once used to quiet business, found themselves under siege. Schultz's enforcers worked with military precision, drive-by shootings, kidnappings, and point-blank executions in crowded tenements. Reports of bodies found in alleys and stairwells stacked up in the NYPD 32nd and 33rd Precinct logs. Many cases vanished into silence, paid off or ignored by corrupt officers. Retaliation was immediate. Bumpy Johnson, already feared for his calm under fire, coordinated counterattacks from back rooms and pool halls. His crews trailed Schultz's foot soldiers, striking back with the same ruthless efficiency. Bombings, stabbings, and close-range shootings became nightly events. Johnson's message was unmistakable. Harlem would not surrender its rackets quietly. This was resistance. Between 1931 and 1935, the violence reached levels unseen in New York's underground. The New York-Amsterdam News tracked the carnage, printing headlines about murder and mayhem on Lenox Avenue. Police and press accounts from the period consistently cite more than 40 deaths tied directly to the numbers war. These figures come from NYPD, homicide blotters, and contemporary crime briefs, but the real total may be even higher. Oral histories from Harlem, old-timers speak of dozens more, their names lost to time or buried by payoffs. Still, the 40-plus number stands as the best documented estimate, flagged in every serious history of the conflict. The human cost stretched beyond the dead. Runners vanished, families mourned, and businesses shuttered. Schultz's men targeted not just the operators, but their families, hoping to terrorize Harlem into submission. Johnson's response was just as personal, sending warnings to anyone who cooperated with the outsiders. The code of silence hardened, and trust became a rare commodity. By 1934, the war had ground into a stalemate. Schultz's firepower could not break Harlem's core resistance, but Johnson's counter-hits drained both money and men. The neighborhood's streets became a map of scars, bullet holes in storefronts, bloodstains on stoops, and whispered stories passed from one generation to the next. The cost of control was measured in funerals and fear. With each new shooting, the pressure on all sides grew heavier. The numbers business, once a lifeline for Harlem, now threatened to destroy the very community it had built. No one could keep up with the mounting losses. The war's brutality forced even hardened gangsters to reconsider how long the fight could continue and at what price. Bumpy Johnson's next move was not made in a back alley or at the end of a gun. Instead, it played out in quiet rooms, away from the chaos on Harlem streets. With the numbers war bleeding both sides, Johnson reached out through trusted intermediaries to the Italian mob's upper ranks. At the center of these talks stood Lucky Luciano, a name already spoken in whispers from Little Italy to the Bronx. Luciano's reputation for business over bloodshed made him the logical counterweight to Schultz's brute force. The logic behind these negotiations was simple but risky. Harlem's numbers racket generated millions each year, but the violence made profits unpredictable and drew unwanted police scrutiny. The Italians did not need more bodies. They needed steady cash and quiet control. Johnson, for his part, wanted to keep Harlem's operations in black hands, free from the kind of daily shakedowns Schultz had demanded. The question was whether a deal could be struck that satisfied both sides without giving up too much. No written contract survives from these meetings. The details come down through a mix of FBI surveillance notes, street gossip, and later memoirs. Some say Johnson offered as little as 20% of Harlem's numbers take. Others claim the tribute ran as high as 40%. The truth, buried in decades of secrecy, likely sits somewhere in between. What's clear is that Johnson insisted on operational autonomy, and he and his people would run the numbers, hire the runners, and manage the payouts. The Italians would collect their cut quietly, without sending their own muscle north of 110th Street. The arrangement was never simple. Oral histories differ on whether Johnson met Luciano himself or worked through mutual contacts. Some versions mention sit-downs in Manhattan clubs. Others point to backroom meetings arranged by lesser-known go-betweens. The FBI's own files from the late 1930s and early 40s reference the new order in Harlem, but stop short of naming the exact terms. What they do show is that after the deal, violence dropped sharply and the numbers racket returned to business as usual, with a portion of the profits now flowing south to the Italian bosses. For Johnson, this was not surrender. It was a calculated trade, tribute for peace, autonomy for survival. The Italians got a steady revenue stream and avoided the political risk of a full-scale Harlem occupation. Schultz, meanwhile, found himself increasingly isolated. With the Italian syndicate now backing Johnson's arrangement, Schultz lost the last outside support he could count on. The war was no longer just about guns and territory. It had become a chess match played in smoke-filled rooms, with Johnson proving himself as much a broker as an enforcer. Dutch Schultz's fortunes began to unravel, not just from bullets, but from forces he couldn't shoot his way out of. In courtrooms across New York, prosecutor Thomas Dewey pressed case after case, dragging Schultz through a gauntlet of tax evasion trials. Each indictment chipped away at his political protection, and headlines began to call him public enemy number one. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover tracked his movements and labeled him a national threat. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, determined to clean up the city, ordered the NYPD to raid Schultz's Harlem clearinghouse in the summer of 1935. Officers seized 10 million policy slips and arrested 14 of his workers, stripping Schultz of his operational stronghold and forcing him to move his base outside city limits. The numbers racket, once a river of cash, now ran dry for him in Harlem. But the legal onslaught was only part of the squeeze. Schultz's war with Bumpy Johnson and Madame St. Clair had already cost him men, money, and territory. Harlem's numbers bankers, once easy targets, now fought back with Mafia support. After Johnson's quiet deal with the Italians, Schultz found himself boxed in. The National Syndicate Council, known simply as the Commission, watched closely. Their rules were clear: no attacks on public officials, no unnecessary heat. When Schultz, desperate and cornered, announced he would kill Dewey to end the prosecution, he crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The Commission had built its power on profit, not chaos. Schultz's plan threatened to bring the full weight of the law down on everyone, Italian, Jewish, and black operators alike. The Mafia bosses, including Lucky Luciano, called for a meeting. Schultz's proposal to assassinate Dewey was met with cold silence. The Commission had seen what happened to gangs that drew too much attention: swift, merciless retribution from the state. Allowing Schultz to act would put every syndicate operation at risk, from Harlem to Little Italy to the Bronx. The calculus was simple: one man's ambition could not outweigh the safety of the entire organization. Schultz, once a valuable asset, had become a liability. The decision was made quietly, efficiently, and without debate. By the fall of 1935, Schultz was isolated. He had lost Harlem to a negotiated peace he could neither join nor disrupt. The law was closing in. His own allies were turning away, and the most powerful criminal council in America had decided he was too dangerous to keep alive. The war for Harlem's numbers racket had become a public crisis, and Schultz's fate was sealed not by a rival's bullet on the street, but by the cold logic of men who valued order over chaos. October 23, 1935. Dutch Schultz sat in the back room of the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, nursing a meal and the last of his options. 4 men entered quietly, their faces familiar only to those who understood the syndicate's way of handling problems. Schultz, alone in the restroom, never saw the gunman. Shots rang out. 45 caliber slugs tore through the tiled silence. In minutes, Schultz lay bleeding on the floor. His associates, Otto Abadaba Berman, Abe Landau, and Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, fell in the crossfire. The killers left as calmly as they had arrived, their work sanctioned by the highest criminal authority in the country. Schultz survived the initial barrage. Paramedics rushed him to Newark City Hospital, where doctors fought to keep him alive. For 22 hours, he drifted in and out of consciousness, raving about money, enemies, and lost chances. Reporters crowded the halls, scribbling down his fevered deathbed monologue. On October 24, 1935, at 8:35 p.m., Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, died from his wounds. The hospital coroner's ledger recorded the cause: multiple gunshot wounds to the abdomen and colon. The New York Times ran the headline, "Beer Baron Shot in Restaurant Dies." The roster of the dead did not end with Schultz. Otto Abadaba Berman, his bookkeeper, died at the scene. Abe Landau, Schultz's chief bodyguard, lingered for hours at the hospital before succumbing. Bernard Lulu Rosenkrantz, another trusted lieutenant, died 2 days later from his injuries. Their names appeared in obituary columns and police logs, the final tally in a war that had claimed dozens more in back alleys and tenement stairwells. No comprehensive list survives. Most deaths remain anonymous, filed away in NYPD, homicide blotters, or whispered in Harlem bars. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson endured long after the shooting stopped. He consolidated control over Harlem's numbers racket, outliving the war by more than 3 decades. Johnson died in 1968 at the age of 62, a figure both feared and respected. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, scarred by years of conflict and betrayal, receded from public life but lived into the 1960s, her legacy cemented in Harlem's memory. The numbers war ended not with a single act of violence, but with a roster of lives cut short, ambitions destroyed, and a city forever changed by the struggle for control. New York Times, October 24th and 25th, 1935. Front page coverage of the Palace Chop House shooting and Dutch Schultz's death. These articles verify the date, location, and sequence of the ambush and the aftermath. New York Times Archive, microfilm reel, 1935, 1024. New York Amsterdam News, from 1931 to 1935. Weekly reports on Harlem's numbers racket, police raids, and the resistance led by Madame St. Clair. This is a primary source for contemporary accounts of violence, community response, and the economic significance of policy banking. Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, microfilm collection, Reel AN, 1931 to 35. Manhattan Office of Chief Medical Examiner, death certificate for Arthur Flegenheimer, known as Dutch Schultz, dated October 24, 1935. Official record confirming cause and date of death. New York City Municipal Archives, shelf PC 1935-1023. New York Police Department 32nd and 33rd Precinct Homicide Blotters from 1931 to 1935. Incident logs documenting shootings, assaults, and policy-related murders in Harlem. Useful for tracking the scale of violence and police response during the numbers war. New York City Municipal Archives, Record Group NYPD, 32/33, 1931 to 35. New York Police Department Incident Report from the summer of 1935. Raid on Schultz's clearinghouse at 550 West 146th Street. It details the seizure of 10 million policy slips, $2,164 in cash, and 14 arrests. Archive call number NYPD raid, 1935, 550 W 146. FBI files on Dutch Schultz and Ellsworth Johnson from 1935 to 1940. Federal surveillance memos referencing Schultz's public enemy #1 designation, Mafia Commission deliberations, and Bumpy Johnson's post-war role in Harlem. Freedom of Information Act release. Schultz, 45, and Johnson, 12, FBI Vault. Schomburg Center Oral History Collection. Interviews with Harlem residents and policy operators, including recollections of Madame St. Clair's leadership and Bumpy Johnson's negotiations. Audio transcripts and photographs. Collection OH67. Photo collection number 1234. Oral history material captures memory and local perspective. Manhattan District Attorney's Office indictment records from 1932 to 1935. Case files on policy-related prosecutions, including witness testimony on tribute demands and operator arrests. New York State Division of Criminal Justice Services, File DA, 1932 to 35 policy. Indictment records show legal response to the numbers war, where documentation is incomplete or based on oral tradition. Contested claims are flagged for further verification. Specific casualty lists, negotiation terms, and internal Mafia correspondence remain absent from available archives. All cited materials are available for public review at the listed repositories. Harlem's underground lottery fueled fortunes and drew lines of power that echo today. The uneasy deals forged in backrooms set patterns for organized crime's reach into black communities nationwide. Even now, questions linger about who profits when the law turns a blind eye. In every city, the struggle for control and autonomy remains unfinished. What power truly changes hands when the game never really ends? Share your thoughts below. On July 2nd, 1973, a 29-year-old drug kingpin named Frank Matthews was supposed to walk into a Brooklyn federal courthouse and face charges that could put him away for 50 years. He never showed. Instead, Frank Matthews, known on the streets as Black Caesar, emptied his safety deposit boxes, picked up his girlfriend Cheryl Denise Brown, and vanished from the face of the earth. He left behind somewhere between $15 and $20 million of a previous life. He left behind a mansion in Staten Island's most exclusive neighborhood, directly across the street from Gambino boss Paul Castellano. He left behind an empire that stretched across 21 states, 2 drug mills in Brooklyn, fortified with steel walls and armed guards, and a closet in his apartment that a visiting dealer once described as packed to eye level with stacks of cash. But most importantly, Frank Matthews left behind 3 young boys and a woman named Barbara Hinton. Barbara was his common-law wife. She had stood beside him through the flashiest years of his rise, the luxury cars, the prime seats at every sporting event, the Las Vegas trips, the fur coats, the rings. She had watched him become the first black drug trafficker in American history to bypass the Italian Mafia entirely and establish direct connections to the French Connection heroin pipeline. She had watched him grow so powerful that the DEA would eventually rank him among the top 10 drug traffickers in United States history. And then, on one hot summer morning, she watched him choose his girlfriend over his family, his freedom over his sons, and $20 million over everything they had built together. The FBI raided the Staten Island mansion. They found an empty safe. Frank Matthews was gone. That was 52 years ago. He has never been found. No fingerprints, no confirmed sightings, no body, no arrest. In December 2025, federal authorities officially ended their search. But what happened to the woman and the 3 boys he left behind? That story, the story nobody tells, might be the most haunting part of the Frank Matthews legend. When Frank Matthews disappeared, the federal government did not just lose a fugitive, they lost their entire case. And they were furious. Their first move was predictable. They went straight to Barbara Hinton. Federal agents descended on the Ocean Parkway apartment in Brooklyn, where Barbara had been living with the 3 boys after the IRS seized their Staten Island mansion. They wanted to know where Frank was. They wanted her to cooperate. They offered full immunity, full protection, a clean slate, if she would tell them anything about her husband's whereabouts, his plans, his contacts, or his escape route. Barbara Hinton refused. The prosecutors did not stop there. They hauled her before a federal grand jury. They pressed her. They threatened her with conspiracy charges, the same charges her husband was facing. They made it clear that if she did not talk, she would pay. Barbara still refused. When agents asked her about Frank Matthews, she gave them a response that became legendary in law enforcement circles. She said she had never heard of a man named Frank Matthews. For 53 years, Barbara Hinton maintained that position. She never cooperated. She never gave authorities a single word. She never remarried. She raised those 3 boys alone, in the shadow of a man the entire federal government was hunting, and she never once broke. The government eventually indicted her. In the 1975 trial of Matthews's associates, 18 members of what the New York Daily News called a black narcotics ring, Barbara was among the defendants. Her lawyer, Gino Galena, argued that the prosecution was an act of retaliation. He told the court that Barbara had been indicted not because she was guilty of drug trafficking, but because she refused to tell the government where Frank Matthews was hiding. According to court transcripts, Barbara maintained that she believed Matthews was dead. Government agents believed she was concealing the information, that she knew exactly where he was. Her case went through the appeals process, with her attorneys arguing bad faith prosecution and claiming the government was using the indictment as leverage to force her cooperation. It didn't work. Barbara never talked. Think about what that means. A woman with 3 children, no visible income after the government seized everything, facing federal conspiracy charges, being told by prosecutors that her life could be destroyed, and she chose silence. Not once, not for a week, for over half a century. Frank Matthews' 3 sons were young children when their father vanished. The oldest was barely old enough to form memories. The youngest may not have remembered him at all. They grew up in the long shadow of a man the whole world was looking for, but who never came home. Before the disappearance, those boys had lived a life most children could not imagine. Matthews had hired a private tutor named Keith Diamond to educate his 3 sons, not at a school, but personally in 1971 at the height of his empire. Diamond was later interviewed for a documentary about Matthews, and he remains one of the few people who spoke about the family's private life. He described a household defined by wealth, loyalty, and an almost surreal level of luxury funded entirely by narcotics. The boys had everything: toys, clothes, a mansion on Tot Hill where Mafia bosses were their neighbors, a father who came home in silk suits and drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. Diamond also described something else. He described a father who, despite everything, was present. Matthews would sit with his sons at dinner. He would ask about their studies. He was generous to a fault, not just with his family, but with strangers. Dealers who visited his apartment said he kept a closet packed to eye level with cash, and he gave away money the way other men gave away handshakes. He paid for neighborhood kids to go to college. He bought groceries for families who could not afford them. He threw parties where everyone ate for free. That was what the boys remembered, or what they were told they should remember. A father who was powerful and generous and larger than life. A man who walked into a room and owned it. A man people respected, feared, and loved in equal measure. And then one morning, that man was gone. What do you tell a 5-year-old whose father has just disappeared? What do you tell a 7-year-old? Barbara had to make a choice that no mother should ever have to make. She could not say he was in prison because he was not. She could not say he was dead because she did not believe that. She could not say he had abandoned them because the Christmas packages suggested otherwise. So she said nothing. She protected them the only way she knew how, with silence. The boys grew up with fragments. A photograph here. A story overheard from an uncle or a family friend. A name whispered in a barber shop. They knew their father was famous, but not the way athletes or musicians are famous. He was famous the way ghosts are famous. Everyone had heard of him. Nobody had seen him. As they got older, the questions got harder. Other kids had fathers at their basketball games, at their graduations, at their weddings. The Matthews boys had a legend. They had a name that made federal agents sit up straight. They had a face on a wanted poster that was aging in a database somewhere, while their real father, if he was alive, was aging somewhere else entirely, in a country they had never been to, living a life they would never know. The cruelest part was not the absence itself. It was the ambiguity. If Frank Matthews had died, they could have mourned. If he had gone to prison, they could have visited. But he had done something worse than either of those things. He had left the door open. He had disappeared into a question mark, and that question mark hung over every holiday, every birthday, every moment where a father should have been standing but was not. People who knew the family said the sons handled it differently. Some carried anger, some carried pride. Some carried both at the same time, furious at a man who had chosen a girlfriend and a suitcase of cash over his own children, but secretly proud that their father had done something no other fugitive in American history had ever accomplished. He had beaten the FBI, the DEA, the IRS, the U.S. Marshals, and the Italian Mafia, all at the same time. And he had never been caught. That is a complicated inheritance. You cannot spend it. You cannot frame it. You cannot put it on a shelf. But you carry it everywhere. Then it was all gone. The mansion seized. The cars taken. The money, whatever Frank did not take with him, was confiscated or spent. Barbara was fighting federal charges. The boys went from being the sons of the most powerful black drug trafficker in America to being the sons of nobody, a ghost. They never got to confront him. They never got to ask him why. They never got to hear his voice explain what he was thinking on that July morning in 1973 when he chose to walk away from everything. They never got the one thing every child of an absent father wants more than anything else in the world, a reason. But here is where the legend gets strange. Over the decades, whispers circulated through the streets and through the networks of people who had known Frank Matthews. The stories were always the same shape. Frank was alive. Frank was somewhere warm. Frank had not forgotten his family. Money occasionally arrived for Barbara and the boys after the disappearance. Not through banks, not through wire transfers. Through people, intermediaries who appeared, delivered, and vanished without explanation. The most famous incident came during Christmas, not long after the disappearance. A package arrived at the family's Brooklyn apartment. Inside was $300,000 in cash. No return address, no card, no signature, just banded stacks of bills, the kind of money that does not come from a savings account. The kind of money that comes from a man who left with $20 million. Barbara never reported it. She never told the authorities. She never spent it in ways that would draw attention. She simply absorbed it into the quiet life she was building for her boys, the same way she absorbed everything else silently, without explanation, without ever acknowledging where it came from or who sent it. But the Christmas money was not the only signal. Over the years, strange messages reached the family through channels that law enforcement could never trace. A phone call from an unknown number, a letter with no return address, postmarked from a country that meant nothing to the agents surveilling the family, but everything to the people inside that apartment. A message passed through a third party, then a fourth, then a fifth, each link in the chain, knowing only the person before them and the person after, never the origin. Classic compartmentalization. The same method Matthews had used to run a 21-state drug empire without a single wiretap catching him for 7 years. The family never confirmed these contacts publicly. They never denied them either. But people close to the family, associates from the old days, people who had worked for Matthews, people who had been in his orbit, said the same thing for decades. Frank was alive. Frank was somewhere warm. And Frank had not forgotten his sons. The documentary producers who made the Frank Matthews story in 2012 conducted roughly 20 interviews with law enforcement, with former associates, with people from Matthews' Baltimore and Brooklyn networks. One of the filmmakers said afterward that reading between the lines of some of the law enforcement interviews, there appeared to be real evidence suggesting Matthews was alive and potentially living in the United States. The U.S. Marshals Service, which handled the fugitive case, was said to believe he was still alive as recently as the 2010s. Cheryl Denise Brown, the girlfriend who disappeared with Matthews, was never found either. Her parents were extensively questioned by authorities. At one point, Brown's parents traveled to Curacao, an island near Venezuela, which added another layer of intrigue. Venezuela was where Matthews's original drug connection, Spanish Raymond Marquez, had fled years earlier. It was where the cocaine came from. It was the one country where Matthews already had infrastructure, contacts, and people who owed him. One investigator reported that a month after the disappearance, IRS agents rushed to a bank in North Carolina after receiving a tip. The bank manager told them they had just missed him. After that, nothing. No fingerprints, no sightings, no confirmed contacts with family members, at least none that federal authorities could prove. The family's silence is itself a kind of testimony. When you look at the facts objectively, there are two theories about what happened to Frank Matthews. The first is that he was killed, possibly by the Genovese crime family, who had reason to want him dead. Matthews had tangled with Genovese associate Ernie Coco Coraluzzo over a 40-kilogram heroin deal at the Waldorf Astoria. When Coraluzzo tried to scam him, Matthews kidnapped his bodyguard. That kind of disrespect toward La Cosa Nostra did not go unpunished in 1973. Under this theory, Matthews was murdered shortly after fleeing, and his body was disposed of. The second theory is that he made it out, that with $20 million, equivalent to roughly $100 million today, and connections stretching from Venezuela to the Caribbean to West Africa, Frank Matthews had the resources, the contacts, and the intelligence to disappear permanently. He had spent years building drug distribution networks that operated in 21 states without being detected. He had stewardesses smuggling heroin in flight bags. He had laundering operations in Las Vegas. He had direct connections to the Corsican underworld in Caracas. If anyone had the infrastructure to vanish, it was him. And the family's behavior tracks with the second theory. Barbara Hinton never cooperated, not once in 53 years. She never remarried. She never publicly mourned Frank as a dead man. She raised those 3 boys alone and kept her silence with a discipline that suggests she had a reason to stay quiet beyond mere stubbornness. The sons grew up private, never publicly revealing contact, but also never publicly accepting that their father was dead. No funeral was ever held, no memorial, no closure, just silence. In the world of organized crime, that kind of silence has a name. It is called protection. In December 2025, after 52 years, federal authorities officially ended their search for Frank Matthews. The FBI closed the case. The DEA moved on. The $20,000 reward, once the highest in federal history and matching the bounty on John Dillinger, was retired. The announcement barely made the news. A paragraph in a few outlets, a mention on a true crime podcast. For the federal government, it was paperwork, the closing of a file that had gathered dust for decades. For the 3 sons of Frank Matthews, it was something else entirely. If Frank Matthews is still alive, he would be 81 years old. He disappeared at 29. He has been missing for longer than most people's entire adult lives. His sons are now men in their 50s, older than their father was when he vanished. They have their own children now, maybe grandchildren. An entire generation that has never met the man whose blood runs through their veins, whose name still makes federal agents pause, whose face, frozen in a handful of photographs from 1972, stares out from a wanted poster that no longer means anything to anyone except the people in that Brooklyn apartment who watched him leave and never come back. Think about what those sons have carried. Every time they looked in the mirror and saw their father's jawline. Every time someone recognized the last name. Every time a stranger asked what their father did for a living, and they had to decide in a split second whether to lie, deflect, or tell a truth that sounds like fiction. My father was the biggest drug dealer in America. He disappeared with $20 million. Nobody has found him in 50 years. He might be alive. He might be dead. I don't know. I've never known. Barbara Hinton kept her secret, whatever it was, to the very end. She outlasted every federal agent who ever questioned her, every prosecutor who ever threatened her, every investigator who ever tried to break her. She never gave them a single word. She never gave her sons a straight answer either. Or if she did, they never shared it with the world. There is no ending to this story. That's the point. That's what makes it different from every other crime story ever told. Frank Lucas got caught, Nicky Barnes got caught, El Chapo got caught, even the ones who died, Bumpy Johnson and Pablo Escobar, at least had endings. Their families knew. The world knew. Frank Matthews has no ending, just a family that waited and a silence that lasted half a century, and 3 boys who became men without ever hearing their father's voice again. Somewhere, maybe, an 81-year-old man is sitting on a porch in a country with no extradition treaty, watching the sun go down, thinking about 3 sons he hasn't held since they were children. Maybe he knows their names. Maybe he knows what they look like now. Maybe he's seen photographs pass through the same invisible network that delivered $300,000 on Christmas morning. Or maybe he's been dead since 1973, and the silence was for nothing, and those 3 boys spent their whole lives waiting for a ghost. Nobody knows, and after 52 years, nobody ever will.